Morning sunlight trickled through the half-open blinds, stretching thin golden streaks across the bedroom floor. The first thing she noticed was the cold. The sheets beside her were empty, stripped of their usual warmth. Instinctively, she reached out, expecting the familiar presence of him, Ethan. But her fingers met nothing but vacant space. Ethan. Her voice was thick with sleep, barely more than a whisper. No answer. A ripple of unease spread through her as she pushed the covers aside and sat up. Something wasn't right. The air in the room felt too still, too hollow. Her pulse picked up as she swung her legs over the side of the bed and padded toward the bathroom. Empty. She moved through the house, her steps growing heavier with each passing second. The closet door gaped open, revealing stark spaces where his clothes used to be. By the front door, the spot where his work boots always sat was bare. The dresser, once cluttered with his watch, his wallet, his keys, stripped clean. A chill crawled up her spine. Ethan wasn't just out for coffee. He wasn't running an errand. He hadn't left for work. He was gone. A sharp breath hitched in her throat as she scrambled for her phone, fingers trembling as she unlocked it. No messages. No missed calls. She dialed his number. Straight to voicemail. Her eyes darted around the house, searching for any sign, any note, any explanation. But there was nothing. No warning. No goodbye. Just silence. But to understand this moment, we have to go back to the night everything changed. McGill's pub smelled like history. Aged wood, worn leather, and the unmistakable scent of fried food clinging to the air. It wasn't fancy, but it was reliable. The kind of place where men came to unwind after a long day, where work boots scuffed against the floors and the clatter of pint glasses filled the spaces between conversation. Ethan Walker sat at their usual booth near the back, a cold bottle of Samuel Adams in his hand, condensation gathering in a ring on the dark wood of the table. He'd spent the last decade working at Westfield Manufacturing, a grueling, physically demanding job, but one that paid well. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And after a long shift, he and his coworkers always knew where to go. Across from him, Jake, his best friend from the company, leaned forward, grinning mid-story. I swear, the kid damn near had a heart attack when Murphy called him into his office. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Looked like he was about to confess to crimes he didn't even commit. Laughter erupted around the table, Ethan's included. It was easy here. Simple. A place where nothing felt complicated. He took a slow sip of his beer, letting the crisp bitterness settle in his bones. He was about to add his own remark when something shifted. A feeling. Something subtle, yet undeniable. His gaze drifted across the bar, and there she was. His wife. She sat in a dimly lit booth, laughter tilting her head back, a glass of deep red wine cradled between her fingers. She looked happy, but not with him. Ethan's grip on the bottle tightened. His eyes flicked to the man beside her. Close. Too close. The way his arm rested along the back of the booth, the way his body leaned toward her, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Just familiarity, comfort, confidence. And then, just as if the universe wanted to brand the moment into his soul, she leaned in and kissed him. Not a fleeting kiss. Not something that could be explained away. A kiss filled with history, with secrets, with betrayal. Something inside Ethan cracked. The world inside McGill's continued uninterrupted. Laughter, conversation, the hum of a football game on the TV above the bar. But in his head, there was nothing. Just silence. A deep, deafening silence. Jake was still talking, still chuckling at his own joke, oblivious to the fact that Ethan's entire life had just come undone in a single moment. And yet, he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react. He simply sat there, staring as the truth unraveled before him like some cruel cosmic joke. His wife was unfaithful, and she had no idea he was watching. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan set his beer down. The condensation from the bottle left a damp ring on the table, a meaningless stain. Just like this moment. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his wallet and tossed a few bills beside his drink. Then, without a word, without so much as a glance back, he stood and walked out of McGill's. The night air struck him like a slap, cold and sharp against the fire burning in his chest. His footsteps echoed against the pavement, steady, unhurried. He had no destination, no plan, only one certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. The night after McGill's, Ethan barely slept. He lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, every muscle tense beneath the weight of what he had seen. His mind played it back in an endless loop, the way her fingers trailed the rim of the wine glass, the tilt of her head as she laughed, the way she leaned into another man. The kiss. By morning, there was no room left for doubt. No space for second-guessing. His wife had betrayed him. The only question was how far it went. Ethan had never been the kind of man to act on impulse. Caution, patience, and logic had always guided him. He believed in facts, in strategy. He knew that in any situation, knowledge was power. So he didn't confront her. He didn't demand explanations she would twist into convenient lies. He didn't scream, didn't rage. Instead, he did something smarter. He went looking for the truth. And that meant hiring someone who could find it. Marcus Hale wasn't what Ethan had imagined when he thought of private investigators. He'd pictured someone older, a trench coat and cigarette type, the kind of man who lurked in the shadows of dimly lit bars. But Hale was younger than expected, somewhere in his late 30s. He was sharp but not flashy, dressed cleanly in a dark suit, his gray eyes calm and assessing. His office was small, tucked away in a quieter part of the city. It smelled of fresh coffee and old paper, a mix of familiarity and discretion. "You're looking for confirmation," Hale said after Ethan laid out his suspicions. He leaned back, folding his hands together. "But let's be honest. You already know." Ethan exhaled slowly. "I need proof." Hale nodded, as if he'd heard those words 1,000 times before. "Fair enough. My standard package includes surveillance photos, time-stamped reports, videos. If necessary, I can pull phone records. I'm discreet. Thorough. No loose ends. How long will it take?" Hale shrugged. "Depends on how sloppy she is. A week, maybe 2. If she's careful, a month." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "But let's be real, Mr. Walker. If you're sitting in this office, you're already past the point of saving this marriage. You didn't come here for answers. You came to end it the right way." Ethan met his gaze, holding it for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "Find me everything." The days that followed were slow, excruciating. Ethan went to work like nothing had changed. He followed the same routine, spoke to the same people, performed the same tasks. Every evening, he sat across from his wife at the dinner table, listening to her talk about her day, watching her smile like everything was normal. And every time his phone vibrated with a message from Hale, he knew the truth was getting closer. Then, one night, the first piece of evidence arrived. A single photo. Ethan opened the message, his breath stilling as he stared at the image. His wife. The same man from the bar. But this time, a different setting, an upscale restaurant on the other side of town. They were close, leaning in, locked in conversation. There was something between them, something unmistakable. Another message followed. Tuesday, 7:42 p.m. The Ledger Restaurant. Ethan set his phone down carefully. His hands were steady. His pulse was not. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a drunken lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, planned, ongoing. And it wasn't over. The investigation stretched into weeks. Hale was ruthless, efficient. Every few days, Ethan received another piece of the puzzle, another timestamp, another location, another undeniable truth. A hotel booking under an alias. Credit card statements filled with charges that had nothing to do with their life together. By then, Ethan had stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly. Still, he hadn't confronted her. Not yet. He was waiting for the full picture, every last detail, every last lie. Then, one evening, Hale handed him a thick envelope. Ethan sat in his office, the folder before him, his hands pressed flat against the desk. He already knew what was inside, but knowing and seeing were two different things. Slowly, he flipped it open. The first page was a report, cold, methodical, and devastatingly thorough. Names, dates, locations, a timeline of betrayal, printed in crisp black ink. The next few pages were photographs. Some were almost innocent, his wife and the man walking side by side, sharing a quiet moment in a cafe. But others were worse. Intimate, undeniable. The last item in the folder was a USB drive. Ethan didn't need to watch the footage. He already knew what was on it. He sat back in his chair, the air in the room thick, suffocating. This was it. The final nail. The marriage was over. His wife just didn't know it yet. And when she did, it wouldn't be because he confronted her. It wouldn't be because he fought. It would be because he left. Without a word. without a trace. Because Ethan Walker was no fool. He was a man who planned, who waited, and now that he had everything, it was time to act. For years, Ethan had prided himself on his discipline, his ability to manage finances with precision, to keep his emotions in check no matter the circumstances. That same control had allowed him to orchestrate his departure with quiet efficiency, slipping away without her ever suspecting a thing. By the time she woke up, he would be gone. No warning, no note, no explanation, just absence. For weeks, Ethan had been methodically erasing himself from the life they had built together. Every step had been handled, every detail accounted for. Their bank accounts had been separated. His share of the savings quietly moved into a private account under his name alone. Joint credit cards? Canceled. Shared bills? Transferred to her. The divorce papers? Finalized. Ironclad. Waiting to be delivered later that morning, long after he was already miles away. Even his resignation had been scheduled. At exactly 8 a.m., Westfield Manufacturing would receive his official notice. No goodbyes, no farewells. They would carry on without him, just as he would without them. A new apartment was waiting for him. Nothing extravagant. Just a temporary place in another city where no one knew his name, where she wouldn't find him. A new job had been lined up, set to begin in a few weeks. Every loose end was tied, every bridge burned. By sunrise, Ethan Walker would no longer exist in this life. It was 4:30 a.m. when Ethan opened his eyes. Not that he had really slept. Lying still, he listened to the silence. The only sound was the steady rhythm of her breathing, deep and undisturbed. She had no idea that when she woke, her world would be different. Carefully, he slipped out of bed, moving through the house with quiet precision. His suitcase and duffel bag sat by the door, already packed with only the essentials, clothes, personal documents, and the few sentimental things he still cared about. The rest? He left it behind. Let her have it. Let her live in the ruins of what she had destroyed. Pausing in the doorway of their bedroom, he looked at her one last time. Months ago, he might have felt something. Pain, regret, maybe even guilt. Now, nothing. On the kitchen counter, his wedding ring lay exactly where he had placed it the night before. He hadn't worn it in weeks. Not since the moment he'd seen her with another man. It was nothing more than a lifeless circle of metal, stripped of meaning. The house smelled faintly of lavender and coffee, a scent that had once felt like home. Now it was just another lie. Ethan inhaled deeply, adjusting the strap of his bag over his shoulder. No hesitation, no second-guessing. He reached for the front door, turned the handle, and stepped into the crisp morning air. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing away the past. By 5 a.m., he was behind the wheel, the highway stretching endlessly before him. The city shrank in his rearview mirror, growing smaller, more distant, until it was nothing but a memory. By the time she woke up, he would already be a ghost in her life. The morning started like any other. She stretched lazily in bed, reaching instinctively for the familiar warmth beside her. But the sheets were cold. Her hand met nothing but empty space. Blinking away the haze of sleep, she sat up. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan always left early for work, but never like this. There was always the soft murmur of the shower, the faint clink of a coffee mug against the counter, the rustling of fabric as he buttoned his shirt. This morning, there was nothing. A strange unease tightened in her chest as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet pressing against the cool hardwood floor. Something was wrong. Moving quickly now, she stepped into the bathroom. Empty. She pulled open the closet doors. Half of it was bare. Her breath hitched. She stepped back, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign that this wasn't what it seemed. Then she turned toward the dresser. The watch he always left on top, gone. His wallet, gone. The boots that sat by the door, gone. His jacket, his keys, the small, everyday things he always tossed onto the chair in the living room, gone. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Ethan was gone. And this time, he wasn't coming back. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, her fingers unsteady as she swiped at the screen. No messages. No missed calls. Her throat tightened as she dialed his number. It rang once, then straight to voicemail. Ethan. Her voice wavered despite her efforts to keep it steady. Hey, where are you? Call me back. She forced herself to breathe. Maybe he had left early for a meeting. Maybe his phone was off. Maybe. But deep down, A voice whispered that this wasn't just an early morning errand, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. Something was wrong. Heart pounding, she hurried downstairs, moving from room to room, searching for any sign of him. The kitchen was untouched. The coffee maker sat unused. The counters, clean. He always brewed a pot in the morning. Always. Her pulse quickened as she turned toward the front door. She stepped outside. His car was gone. Panic surged through her as she rushed back inside, dialing his number again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Her hands shook as she scrolled through her contacts and tapped his office number. The receptionist answered on the second ring. Westfield Manufacturing. How can I help you? Hey, this is Lauren Walker. Can I speak to Ethan? A pause. I'm sorry, Mrs. Walker. Ethan resigned a few days ago. The world tilted. I'm sorry, what? She gripped the phone tighter. That can't be right. Are you sure? Yes, the woman confirmed. His last day was yesterday. Lauren stood frozen, barely hearing the receptionist ask if she was okay. He had quit. Without telling her. The phone nearly slipped from her grasp. She ended the call and immediately dialed Jake, one of Ethan's closest friends from work. It rang and rang. Finally, Jake answered, his tone casual. Hey, Lauren. She didn't waste time. Where's Ethan? Silence. Then, hesitation. I don't know. You work with him. You must know something. I swear, he didn't say much. Just mentioned he was moving on. Jake's voice was cautious, uncertain. Moving on to where? She snapped. A long pause stretched between them. I wish I could help. Jake finally said, softer this time. She didn't let him finish. She hung up. Her fingers flew over her phone, calling anyone who might have an answer. His other friends. His family. No one knew anything. Some sounded confused. Others hesitant. A few avoided the conversation altogether. Panic clawed at her chest, tightening into something dark and suffocating. Ethan wasn't at work. Ethan wasn't answering his phone. Ethan wasn't anywhere. Desperation took over as she ran to his office, yanking open drawers, searching through papers, looking for anything, any clue, any trace. Nothing. His personal documents, his files, gone. The pen he always used. The book that never left his desk. Gone. She checked the closet again, pulling back clothes, as if she had somehow missed something the first time. But all she found were empty hangers, blank spaces where his shoes had been, the absence of his scent lingering on his side of the bed. And then, finally, the realization hit. He hadn't just left for the morning. He had left her. Her knees threatened to give out, and she clutched the edge of the dresser to keep herself steady. With trembling hands, she called him one more time. Straight to voicemail. Tears burned her eyes as she whispered into the receiver. Ethan, please. Her voice cracked. Call me. Just tell me where you are. She waited for the beep. It never came. Just silence. She tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. A sob built in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't break. Not yet. Instead, she forced herself to move, heading downstairs, scanning the house with wild, frantic eyes. Maybe she had missed something. A note. An email. Some kind of explanation. Something. But the house gave her nothing. No clues. No goodbyes. Just silence. Hours passed. The reality of it pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating, sinking into her bones. She sat on the couch, her phone useless in her hands, staring at nothing. Ethan was gone, and it was her fault. Her mind spun, scrambling for a reason, an answer, anything to explain why he had disappeared without a word. But she already knew. She had been careless, too comfortable in her deception, too certain she could hide her lies forever. She thought she had time, thought she had control. But Ethan had known. He had seen through her. And instead of confronting her, instead of letting her explain, he had simply vanished. A chill ran down her spine as realization settled in. This wasn't a rash decision. This wasn't a moment of anger, a knee-jerk reaction to betrayal. This was deliberate. He had watched. He had waited. He had planned. And when the time came, he had walked away, without a word, without a trace. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. She had betrayed him, and in return, he had erased himself from her life. No fights, no final words, just the quiet click of a closing door and a silence that would haunt her forever. Ethan drove, the highway stretching endlessly ahead of him, the past shrinking in his rearview mirror. The city he had built his career in, The house he had shared with his wife. The streets that once felt like home. All of it was behind him now. What lay ahead was a new life. A life without deception. Without lies. Without the weight of a love that had crumbled under betrayal. He didn't look back. Didn't allow himself to feel regret. He had spent too many nights wrestling with his emotions. Too many weeks detaching himself from everything he once believed in. Now, it was time to start over. Asheville, North Carolina, was nothing like the city he had left behind. Nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, it was quiet, lined with winding streets and small coffee shops, wrapped in the kind of stillness Ethan hadn't felt in years. His new apartment was simple. One bedroom, a small balcony overlooking a sleepy street. Nothing extravagant, but it was his. No ghosts of the past. No painful memories. Just a place to begin again. Work came easily. An engineering firm, smaller than the one he had left, free from corporate politics and relentless ambition. It was exactly what he wanted. His co-workers were friendly, but he kept his distance. He wasn't ready to let anyone in. His days followed a steady rhythm. Mornings jogging under tree-lined streets. Coffee from the same quiet cafe. Long hours at work. Evenings spent reading or walking through town as the sun set over the mountains. There was comfort in solitude, a quiet reassurance that he had made the right choice. And yet, a part of him wondered if this was all there was. If he was meant to be alone forever. It happened on a Saturday. Ethan had wandered to the local farmer's market, not looking for anything in particular, just something to fill the empty spaces of his weekend. That was when he saw her. She was standing at a produce stand, fingers gently brushing a bundle of fresh basil, her expression thoughtful. There was something natural about the way she moved, something warm in the way she smiled at the vendor. As she handed over a few bills, she caught him watching. "You should try the strawberries," she said, holding up a small basket. "They're the best in town." Ethan hesitated, then took a step forward. "That's so." She nodded. "I come here every weekend. Trust me." He bought the strawberries. And that was how it began. Claire was different. Her kindness wasn't forced. Her warmth didn't come with expectations. She was a teacher, spending her days surrounded by children, always carrying the gentle patience of someone who loved what they did. She never pried into his past, never pushed, never questioned the things he wasn't ready to talk about. And somehow, that made it easier to let her in. Their weekends turned into long walks through the city, quiet dinners, late-night conversations over coffee. With Claire, there were no shadows lurking in the background. No hesitation, no doubt, just clarity. She was nothing like the woman he had left behind. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to be happy. Within a year, they were married. It was small, simple. Close friends gathered beneath the shade of an old oak tree, where quiet vows were exchanged with no stress, no complications. Just two people who had found something real. For the longest time, Ethan had believed marriage was something he would never want again. That trust was something he would never rebuild. But then, Claire had come into his life. And for the first time in years, he believed in love again. But with Claire, everything was different. She was steady, unwavering. She never gave him a reason to doubt, never made him feel like he was walking blindfolded into something fragile. This was a marriage built on truth, not illusions. Trust, not pretense. And when Claire told him she was pregnant, something shifted inside him. Something that made this new life feel whole. The first time Ethan held his newborn daughter, he realized just how far he had come. He had walked away from pain, had rebuilt himself from nothing, had found love, family, a future that no longer felt uncertain. Looking down at the tiny fingers curled tightly around his own, he made a silent promise. To never let the past define him. To protect this life he had built. To finally let go of the ghosts that once haunted him. For months, he had lived in peace. No longer looking over his shoulder. No longer waiting for the past to catch up. His days were filled with work. Evenings with his wife. Nights spent rocking his daughter to sleep. His old life, the betrayal, the pain, felt like something that had happened to someone else. But the past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you run. It was a quiet afternoon when it happened. Claire had taken their daughter to visit her parents, leaving Ethan alone for the first time in weeks. He had just stepped outside to check the mail when he saw the car parked at the curb. At first, he thought nothing of it. A lost traveler stopping for directions. A neighbor's visitor. Then the driver's side door opened, and she stepped out. Lauren. For a long moment, Neither of them moved. She looked different. Her hair was pulled back, her face thinner than he remembered. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, a far cry from the designer outfits she used to favor. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard. Wide, uncertain, filled with something that almost looked like fear. Ethan tightened his grip around the stack of mail in his hands. He hadn't prepared for this. Lauren took a hesitant step forward. "Ethan," she said, barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. She swallowed, glancing at the house behind him. "I had to find you." His stomach turned. Of course she had. He had erased himself from her world. But Lauren had never been the type to accept being ignored. She had always needed control, always needed the last word. Ethan exhaled slowly. "How did you find me?" Lauren shifted on her feet. It wasn't easy. That much, at least, was true. He had covered his tracks well, ensuring she would never be able to reach him. But persistence had always been one of her strongest traits. And now, here she was, standing in front of him as if she had any right to be. "Ethan, please." Her voice wavered. "Just give me a few minutes." There was a time when hearing her plead would have softened him, when the sight of her looking fragile would have made him listen. But not anymore. Still, he wasn't about to have this conversation in the driveway. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a few curious neighbors peeking through their windows. The last thing he wanted was an audience. Wordlessly, he stepped aside. Lauren hesitated, then walked past him into the house. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the faint scent of fresh coffee. Lauren looked around, her gaze drifting across the framed photos on the walls. Pictures of Claire, of their daughter, of a life she had never been part of. Ethan shut the door behind them and crossed his arms. "Say what you need to say." Lauren turned back to him, her expression uncertain. "I didn't know what happened," she murmured. "One day you were there, and the next, you were just gone." "That was the point," Ethan said flatly. Her eyes flickered with something. Pain? Regret? Maybe both. "I deserved an explanation." A humorless laugh escaped him. "You deserved an explanation?" He shook his head. "You lost the right to explanations the moment you decided to betray me." She flinched, but she didn't look away. "I wasn't thinking, Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I made mistakes, but you left without a word. You didn't even let me explain." There was nothing to explain. Lauren took a step closer. "I still loved you." Ethan exhaled sharply, bitterness rising like bile in his throat. "No, Lauren, you didn't." She flinched, but he didn't stop. "You loved the idea of me. You loved the comfort of our life, the convenience of our marriage. But if you had truly loved me, really loved me, you never would have done what you did." Tears welled in her eyes, but he didn't care. She wiped them away quickly. "I've been searching for months," she whispered. "I just needed to see you, to understand why you never gave me a chance to fix it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because some things can't be fixed." Lauren let out a shaky breath. "Do you hate me?" He paused, considering the question. There was a time when the answer would have been yes. In those first few weeks, when the betrayal was still raw, when every memory of her felt like a wound splitting open again, he had hated her with a fury that had nearly consumed him. But now? "No," he said finally. "I don't hate you, Lauren. You're just nothing to me anymore." Her face crumpled at that, but she nodded. Ethan turned and walked to the bookshelf, reaching for the thick, plain manila folder he had tucked away months ago. He had debated whether he would ever need it again. Now it was time. He turned back and held it out to her. "You want to know why I left?" Lauren hesitated before taking the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked down at it, then back at him. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan crossed his arms. "The truth." Slowly, she opened it. The moment her eyes landed on the first page, he saw the color drain from her face. A photo. Her. And the man from the bar. A different night. A different place. But unmistakable. The way she leaned into him. The way his hand rested on her knee. The kind of closeness that left no room for doubt. Her breath hitched. She turned the page. Another photo. A restaurant. She was laughing, her eyes shining, completely lost in whatever he had said. And the man, he was looking at her in a way Ethan had once looked at her. Before everything changed. Lauren swallowed hard and turned another page. A hotel receipt. Her name wasn't on it, but Ethan had known where to look. The date matched the night she had told him she was working late. The charge had appeared on a credit card statement she never thought he would check. Her hands shook as she flipped to the next page. Text messages. Printed screenshots of conversations she thought had been erased. Words laced with affection. Secret plans. Things she had never said to Ethan in the final years of their marriage. Her breathing became uneven, her lips parting slightly as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. She kept turning. More photos. More receipts. More evidence. Everything laid out before her. Undeniable. Inescapable. By the time she reached the last page, her hands were gripping the folder so tightly that the edges crumpled beneath her fingers. Silence stretched between them. Ethan watched as she struggled to speak, her throat working, her jaw trembling. Ethan, She shook her head, looking utterly lost. I didn't. I never. Don't. His voice was calm. Firm. Don't lie. Not now. Her eyes filled with tears, but he remained unmoved. She knew. She knew there was no excuse. No redemption. And finally, she had to face it. The air in the room grew heavier with each passing second, thick with unspoken words, regret, and the weight of a truth that could no longer be denied. Lauren's lips parted, trembling as if to form a plea, an explanation, anything that might change what was already set in stone. She looked up at Ethan, searching his face. For anger, for sadness, for even the faintest flicker of the love they had once shared. But she found nothing. His expression was cold, empty. A shaky breath escaped her, and the tears she had been fighting finally broke free, slipping down her cheeks. Ethan, He didn't move. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Please, just let me explain. Explain what? His voice was flat, detached. She wiped at her face, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't like that. A quiet, humorless laugh escaped Ethan's lips. He tilted his head slightly, considering her words, not with curiosity, but with the indifference of someone listening to a stranger spin a story they had no interest in. Not like that, he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. She took a step forward, instinctively reaching for him. I made a mistake. Ethan took a step back. Small, subtle, but enough. The message was clear. Lauren froze. Her breath hitched as she looked down at the folder still clutched in her hands. She gripped it tighter for a moment, then let her arms fall to her sides. I never stopped loving you, she whispered. He didn't react. A quiet sob broke from her lips as she shook her head. I thought we could fix this. Ethan's voice was like steel. There is no we, Lauren. There hasn't been for a long time. She squeezed her eyes shut, her shoulders shaking. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please, Ethan, I'll do anything. Just tell me what to do. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Ethan stood. Lauren's teary eyes locked onto him, pleading, desperate. But he didn't look at her. He walked to the front door, his movements calm, deliberate. Without a word, he reached for the handle, turned it, and pulled the door open. Cool air drifted in from outside, sharp against the suffocating tension in the room. And then, finally, he looked at her. His eyes, once filled with warmth for her, were now hollow. And in a voice devoid of emotion, he spoke the last words she would ever hear from him. Get out. Lauren's breath hitched, a choked sound escaping her lips. She hesitated, as if some small part of her still believed she could change his mind, that there was something left to salvage. There wasn't. With slow, unsteady steps, she moved past him, as though walking through a dream or a nightmare. She stopped just outside the door, turning back one last time, her eyes begging for something. Anything. But Ethan didn't wait. He didn't look back. He didn't say another word. He simply closed the door. And with that final act, he sealed the past away forever.